AP Euro Redesigned DBQ. Now basically what I'm going to talk about can be applied to the AP US or AP World DBQ, but we're going to work specifically with the European DBQ. Now memorize these instructions, be conversant with these instructions, and understand that every word in here is meant to help you. College Board wants you to understand exactly what you need to do, and in order to gain as many points as possible, you're going to need to make sure you're totally aware of every facet. The main point here, I think you see, will be the formulation of and the support of your thesis. Now, your thesis, we're going to talk about that in good detail, but your thesis drives the entire response to the DBQ prompt. It is not a restatement of the prompt. It is not a list of the categories or groups that you decided to put the sources into. It is a definitive statement that addresses the prompt based on one judgment you've made about these sources collectively. Now, the first thing to do is to deconstruct the prompt. The prompt is the essence of the DBQ. It is why you're looking at the sources. It is how you're going to formulate your thesis. It is how you're going to substantiate that thesis. And it's how you're going to write up the essay in response to this prompt. So we need to make sure that we look at this in good detail. Again, College Board works diligently to ensure that this prompt has been thoroughly vetted by a number of people on a number of different layers. So there are no wasted words at all. And we're going to look at each one of those throughout. Main thing to pay attention to are the command words. In other words, the words that prompt you to actually use your historical skills and try to explain yourself in a way that's going to maintain an argument throughout your entire prompt. Now, the four main parts to pay attention to in the prompt are the instruction, that's the command word, the given factor, what is this DBQ centering on, what's the context, what era are we looking at, the focus, and the particular time period. So I know the given factor and the time period seem to be the same. They don't. The time period is actually making more reference to the contextualization you're expected to be able to demonstrate on this DBQ response. Okay, you can read everything else that's down below, but I'll hit the main points here. Evaluate, and to what extent? This is a relatively complicated prompt. It's asking you to do higher order thinking, that is assess, evaluate, by way of to what extent. So when it says to what extent, it's really trying to get you to see that there are perhaps other ways that this might have been interpreted, and you are going to interpret this in such a way as to determine definitively what that judgment might be. Focus is here in the prompt, experience of war. Now, with the AP Euro DBQ, there are going to be sources that will be presented. In these sources, what you'll find are these experiences of war. And depending on the extent to which you have a good background on the DBQ topic, that allows you to really understand and be able to articulate the experiences of war that are presented by way of the documents. But also, don't forget, the concept here is for you to be able to identify maybe some omissions of other experiences of war that haven't been included in the context of the question. Might possibly ask you to go a little bit deeper than just what the source presents. You might know a little bit more about experiences of war in association with one or two of the other documents. Now, further with the focus, it goes on to talk about altered the lives of women. Now, a casual read of the prompt may result in simply disregarding the intent of the prompt. Altered is changed over time. Did things change or did they not? Change in continuity over time. Altered the lives of, then you have to consider, what is it about a person's life that needs to be addressed in association with the information given, plus your own knowledge. And further, altered the lives of women. Well, there we go. And this is a definite clue that they kind of hope that you have a pretty good understanding as to how women's lives were altered through the experience of war. Now, the given factor is the First World War and its immediate aftermath. In association with what the given factor is, the topic, the subject, the historical period, you either are very familiar with, or not so familiar with. However, I think you'll notice this is relatively broad. Anyone who's studying AP European history is going to have a pretty good understanding of this incredibly important event. And again, I'm not addressing absolutely everything that's written down below because you can surely read that or pause that during the presentation. Now, time period is part of the given factor, and sometimes in the DBQ prompt there will be a range of dates, and that range of dates is essentially what you're obliged to make comment upon. So when it says the First World War and its immediate aftermath, clearly we're looking at 1914 probably up to 1920. Now, this is just simply deconstructing the prompt, assuming we have not looked, and you have not, looked at any of the other sources yet. So when it does say immediate aftermath, that might be a little ambiguous, but we probably could take that up to perhaps the end of the Paris Peace Conference, up to 1920. And I think 1920 is a pretty good date. So what you're doing when you deconstruct the prompt is you are by hand taking that pen and making notes absolutely everywhere you can. And these notes need not be elaborate, but what they probably ought to do is reflect what you're thinking at that particular time. And you are doing this in a relatively rapid manner just to ensure that you have something up there to look at as you begin to construct the rest of your response. And that was just the prompt. So essentially, according to the guidance from the College Board, you absolutely positively must use at least 4 sources and their content. Now, there'll be somewhere between 6 and 7 sources. And while you do have some reading time prior to the writing, it's going to be a little bit difficult to thoroughly invest yourself in absolutely every source as if this was classwork or homework. So we're going to have to pay attention to the captions because the captions are worth their weight in gold. Now again, the more familiar you are with this DBQ topic, the more likely you can already begin to formulate a conception of what it's going to be about, what you need to address, and what your thesis statement might be. At this juncture, I'm going to add that we do not write our introduction first. We do not write our thesis statement early. We write the introduction and we write the thesis statement last. And we do that because it would be totally asinine to consider writing an introduction and a thesis statement to an essay you've yet written or sources you've yet investigated. Here's a mnemonic that I found, which might be a little bit helpful concerning looking at the sources and what may I be able to comment upon. Now, this is pretty basic stuff as far as source analysis is concerned, so I'm sure you're pretty well schooled with that. And the captions. If the prompt is constructed in such a way that it is nearly a perfect device to test your source analysis skills, then the captions themselves are incredibly helpful. I will go so far as to say the more familiar you are with the topic that's presented by the DBQ, the more the captions have to offer for you. And I would say read the captions first. I would make all my decisions concerning categorizing and grouping of the sources based on the caption, and I think you'll find that they are incredibly informative concerning that objective of grouping. Once you understand those sources, once you've fundamentally group them, then you can make a decision which ones you think are worth investing your time in. Again, remember, you are only obliged to use the content of 4 of the sources. And again, by using the content, we do not mean replicating, simply taking what's in the source and writing it down as if it was something of your own creation. No, you're adding value to the information in the source. That's what they're specifically referring to when they say you must use, and you are obliged to use 4 of the sources. You must analyze, add value to, use it to substantiate what is going to be your thesis statement. So the documents that follow come from the only released redesigned DBQ that I was able to find. And we'll take a quick run through here because you can, of course, take the time to read through here. But do note the caption. And it says source, and then it gives you the title that would have been at the heading of this cover illustration, Votes for Women. That's the name of the magazine. And they tell you it is a weekly magazine. And when was this issued? 26 November, 1915. Now below, we see Prime Minister Asquith. And there's some dialogue down below. You can read that through. It's a cartoon. Okay, not necessarily satirical or not funny in any way, shape, or form, but we'll call this a sketch or a cartoon. And what it is clearly trying to indicate is, there it says right there, political freedom for women. Political freedom for women. Now, there's a number of other events associated with this. You might understand or know 1915, the Germans had begun unrestricted submarine warfare. This is talking about a ship that had sunk and how the nurses were very brave and how the nurses wanted the wounded to go first. Now, you should be clearly thinking about a prior suffragette movement in Britain in particular, but in the United States, in Canada, Australia, etc. Many different places. And the second source, okay, it is, and you know, the first thing I'm looking for when I look at the source, when I look at the caption, is I'm trying to find out what type of document is this. So it's a letter. Now this seems to be probably a personal letter. Now, yes, that's a primary source. Now, this letter from one person to another, from one military official to a government official in 1916, is probably going to disclose true feelings, true opinion. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't biased. It can be biased, but it is coming straight from Paul von Hindenburg, who perhaps you know is one of the great German generals of the Great War. And then later take your time to read down through here. Document 3. Now, you don't know who Countess de Corzin is, but they tell you a French author, and that's the book that she wrote. And I think the title in and of itself tends to let you understand what the entire work was about. But the title, Countess, so a member of the aristocracy, an author, and this is going to be her experience of war. Madeline Ida Bedford, who's she? Well, she's a middle class poet. So you see we go from aristocracy to middle class. Now middle class, make sure you understand, middle class is perhaps not how we understand middle class to be. Middle class, that would be a person who is propertied, who does not derive a salary working for someone else. In other words, and I'm going to be so bold as to say in 1917 that Madeline Ida Bedford perhaps might be the wife of someone else or the daughter of someone else. She may not be maintaining herself on her own property in 1917. Voice of the working class women. So now this poem is meant to reflect in Miss Bedford's eyes the situation with middle class women and their experience of war through her understanding. And this comes from a private in case you didn't know, is the lowest rank in the infantry. It does say so right here, frontline soldier. And this is World War I, so we're talking about trench warfare. Brutal, terrible, dismal trench warfare toward the end of the war. Don't know exactly when in 1918, but this again is another letter. It's a letter to his fiancée, Ethel Baxter. Now here you have to show a little bit of empathy. Empathy meaning, how will she feel when she receives this? What has been her experience through his letters of the war? What is he saying to her in that letter? Document 6, Maria Bochkavra, Yashka, Russian woman soldier, and then there's the title of her memoir. So a memoir is an autobiography. A memoir is very introspective. Memoirs do reveal from the writer's perspective a great deal about their life and their feelings and opinions, etc. Now this is 1919. This is when it was published. This is talking about her experience in the war. She says, it says in the title that she is an officer, and you should find that a little bit surprising unless you know that Russia went through 2 revolutions in 1917, and unless you know about the Bolsheviks and the inclusion of women in the military and etc., etc. That's very important for you to know. And again, this is why the captions are so incredibly important. That all by itself does give you an understanding as to what is going to be written. It's the initial look at the document, allowing you to categorize or to group this in association with the other documents. And document 7, this is a statistical table. We don't know exactly where that's from, but we know what it's about. Women as a percentage of the industrial force. Whenever we see a graph, a chart like this, a table, we're supposed to try to understand change over time. That's essentially why this information is presented. So we are concerned with 1914 to its immediate aftermath, 1920, and we're supposed to make a determination of, well, here it says, how many women are in the workforce? Why might it have declined from 1918 to 1919? Well, the war is over, the men have come home. Some of them have assumed their positions. Some of the other women have gone back, perhaps back to secretarial jobs or to more traditional jobs for women, or perhaps have gotten married and started a family with the return of their boyfriends, husbands, fiancés, whatever that situation might be. One thing to make sure you're able to do, and this is absolutely key, is to not only group the sources, but to cross-reference. You notice that the sources were ordered chronologically. You'll notice that the sources had a sense of logic, the way that they were ordered as well. There's a lot of thought that is given to how this exam is presented to you to give you as much assistance as possible with your source analysis. Now, I firmly believe that cross-referencing can be done by just the captions alone. However, clearly, if we only have to invest ourselves in 4 of the sources, I think we can probably manage to make a judgment to try to see if there are any contradictions. And again, remember, this is source analysis, so you need to be analytical. Not necessarily critical, but you need to make sure you observe the content of the source enough so as to use it as evidence in explaining your thesis. And you have not yet developed a proper thesis statement. This is why you're going to write your introduction and your thesis last. Now, making sure that you can invest yourself in the captions will give you that opportunity to cover more sources more thoroughly a little bit later on. Reliability and trustworthiness. This is incredibly important for you as a student on this exam to be able to make that determination. I haven't talked about bias because absolutely every source that you're going to look at is biased, And it is important to be able to detect the bias from the source. And again, sometimes we get that from the caption. But the next step, the next analytical step, is to talk about its reliability. Reliability as a source. Can I trust what it's saying? Can I trust the information? Does it help me make a judgment? Is it worthy of substantiating my thesis or not? So at this juncture, I'm going to let you know that you probably noticed that 7 sources, while a little bit easier on your brain, 7 sources isn't as many sources as you might imagine that could be included in this particular DBQ. We're hoping that you may identify an omission. What source, what type of source might they have left out? So when you're doing the cross-referencing of the existing sources in the DBQ, you may actually think of, and do record this, you may actually think of a source that you've come across that would be useful, that you're actually using in your mind as a means of comparison and contrasting. So here's some useful phrases for source analysis. I'm going to let you look at these. I find that with most students, this is a very difficult thing to do, and that is to come up with the wording that's going to be helpful in trying to get across what's in my mind on the paper. And the context and contextualization. As I said before, your own knowledge and the application of your own knowledge is very important. You don't want to get off track. You don't want to include information that is irrelevant, but you want to make sure that you can put these sources in context, not just in the years 1914 to 1920, not just in the early part of the 20th century, but you want to be able to put these in the rich context of other sources you're aware of. Here, contextual evaluation of sources, clear and substantial evaluation of different historical interpretations. This is an outstanding opportunity for you to consider an author. You must have had a reading, perhaps Wilfred Owen, a poet, or perhaps something beyond your textbook that you may be able to make reference to. There are a number of other authors I think you should probably know by name in order to, again, put this in context, put this in what we call, historiographical analysis. Now, when we compare sources, here are, or what does follow, are some grading rubrics, information that you may not have. I'm sure your teachers have conveyed this to you during the class, or perhaps when they diagnostically mark your work, they've written information like this down. But I think this is incredibly important for you to see. Again, it's like deconstructing the prompt. It's also like making sure you're thoroughly conversant with the instructions. You need to get into the head of the people who make this test so that you know exactly what you need to do in order to get the maximum number of points. Again, these grading rubrics are pretty straightforward. It doesn't necessarily mean point by point you would have to address everything, but I think what this provides for you is a shaping opportunity for you to shape your responses. And especially in the run-up to the exam, you're going to want to be thinking in terms of how and what do they want me to write. And time again, as you read down through here, analysis, evaluation, and substantiating and making sure that you're establishing a thesis that can be proved. Here, documents as a set, okay, supporting contextual knowledge, and then at the bottom, and these are things you'll have to sort out for yourself. Hopefully English is familiar to you. English grammar is pretty solid. And your spelling needs to be relatively accurate, and it does need to be legible. Right? Challenge the interpretation of the past. Integrate precisely selected knowledge from the sources. Okay? And again, I did mention this beforehand, but do not write down full sentence quotes. Absolutely ridiculous. You make reference to the author, reference to the source. Perhaps you include a word or two in a lengthy source so that someone can focus on what you're trying to highlight, but do not replicate. First of all, it's a waste of time. Second of all, you get absolutely no credit for doing that at all. Now, this is specific advice for DBQs from AP readers. And line by line, okay, line by line, it's going to be trying to help you understand exactly what needs to be done. And this is something to visit and revisit. This is not as if you're going to be able to handle absolutely everything that's suggested here. But as you prepare for the exam and revise and look over your notes and maybe do some practice DBQs, do consider what is down here, because this comes straight from the people that are going to look at your script. Okay, and toward the end, this is all available online. I just included it in here for you. And, you know, a rubric with scoring notes is absolute gold as well. And here this is what they're obliged to look for when they're reading your response. So these are the rules, if you will. These are the rules that they go by in order to award you points. And I think if you write this out in your own hand, or maybe you make a diagram or some sort of graphic organizer to use to help you look at that and think about that and go over that time and time again, and that'll be your mental checklist. And here at the end, these are your historical thinking skills, which I'm sure you've already gone over with your teacher, but you know, this is kind of the rationale behind the DBQ, behind the tasks, behind the questions. You know, why are you taking this course? Why are you writing this? Because we're trying to attest and see the extent to which you've developed historical thinking skills.